Eloise in Oxonia, a creative podcast by the Oxford Writers' House. Follow English student Eloise Weaver as she moves through the city of Oxford, encountering stories, past and present. Eloise's adventures are fantasy, but the authors, people and ideas she encounters are as real as you and I.
I hardly slept at all last night. I've been working on my 19th century paper. It's all wrong, and the longer I stare at it, the less it makes sense. There's a knock on my door. It's Omari. He wants to talk before lunch. I must look a mess. Yes, of course, I'll meet him in the JCR for a talk. I'm starting to get used to these wellness talks. It's a small college. Word gets out. Can Omari know anything about the unexpected card game in the MCR? Maybe my performance hasn't passed the test. Last night, Quincy and Jax both made toasts during formal hall. Quincy's was predictable. He thanked the college, the staff, his colleagues. Very professional, very strategic. We had a few other toasts.
Toasting amuse. One man who came to dinner wouldn't eat, just focused on his hostess' instant, eloquent devotion. He'd stand and say, as if proposing a toast, "I speak this in your honor, ma'am, you are so beautiful," then chant some passionate verse and sit and drink some more until the spirit moved in him again, then stand and say, "You are so beautiful," etc., and do another item. Funny fellow, poet, mad as hell. I been there, sort of. For in that ambience, I too was smitten by what seemed to me unusual radiance, beauty of spirit lighting up the place. But I kept quiet about it, made small talk, stayed sober, and enjoyed the food.
Jax's toast was strange and left a lingering silence in hall before a polite applause. Today, as I slowly wake up, brushing my teeth under the harsh overhead lights, I try to remember what Jax said in his toast. He gave me a strange look. Then he toasted beauty, danger, and the night. He toasted bravery, inquisitiveness, and then read some alliterating passages from a former professor of poetry, Seamus Heaney. I remember the poem. It's called Scaffolding.
Masons, when they start upon a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. Make sure the planks won't slip at busy points. Secure all ladders, tighten bolted joints. And yet all this comes down when the job's done, showing off walls of sure and solid stone. So if, my dear, there sometimes seem to be old bridges breaking between you and me, never fear. We may let the scaffolds fall, confident that we have built our wall.
What had he meant by this selection? I felt the toast was aimed somehow. He definitely gave me a look before he read. It made me uneasy. Was he trying to tell me something? Am I going mad? I meet Omari in the JCR. The JCR is slightly less well equipped than the MCR. There is a battered pool table in the centre of the room and a coffee machine which is refilled twice daily. Sometimes there are newspapers, if we're lucky and nobody is greedy enough to pilfer them. Omari pours some tepid coffee into small ceramic mugs, gently placing silver stirring spoons on the lip of each saucer. We sit next to one another at wood tables with hundreds of pale imprints, concentric circles left from mugs of decades past. I think about all those thousands of coffee mugs and the thousands of conversations had across these tables. Omari's hair is plaited in long braids, and he wears a sharp blazer at all times, as if he is ready to get stuck into some important diplomatic effort at the drop of a pin. He looks fresh and has kind eyes. "So," he says, "what's been going on with you?" I'm worried. I can't tell him the truth. The truth is, I may be losing my mind. I tell him I'm just underslept because of the 19th century paper deadline. I know it can be hard, Eloise, as someone who came from much further away, to make the social adjustments to Oxonia, he says. I nod. I just want to say, he goes on, that you always have my support. Do not be afraid to reach out. I'm here for you. I thank him. He is a genuinely considerate person. But he is a college father, and as in all families, there is a divide between the world inhabited by children and the world inhabited by their parents. It's time for the afternoon lectures. I walk down High Street. Today there is a special lecture on Seamus Heaney, who was Professor of Poetry here from 1989 to 1994. Even though he was surrounded by the pomp and circumstance of his position, Heaney's poetry remains stubbornly in a universe of untamed places. He wrote,
You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather ahead before he hurls the lightning? Well, just now he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. It shook the earth and the clogged under-earth, the river Styx, the winding streams, the Atlantic shore itself. Anything can happen. The tallest towers be overturned, those in high places daunted, those overlooked regarded. Stropped beak fortune swoops, making the air gasp, tearing the crest off one, setting it down, bleeding on the next. Ground gives. The heavens' weight lifts up off Atlas like a kettle lid. Capstones shift, nothing resettles right. Telluric ash and fire spores boil away.
The lecture has begun in the exam schools. It's a full house today, and I push past satchels and book bags to find my place in a relatively empty row of seats.
So, Seamus Heaney was an Irish poet born in April 1939, so only several months after the death of W.B. Yeats. Unlike Yeats, he was born in what was then had become known as the Six Counties of Northern Ireland. He was defiantly kind of Irish. Ireland, as you know, was partitioned in 1921. So he grew up near a village called Balahi in County Derry, about 30 miles from Belfast. And he came to Oxford then as Oxford Professor of Poetry in 1989. He stayed at Magdalen College. Bernard O'Donoghue was there then, and actually Oscar Wilde had been a student there. And then he was also an honorary fellow of St John's College. But of course he had other commitments too at the same time as he was in Oxford, so it wasn't as if he was here in an unbroken kind of spell. He still had his commitment at Harvard and so on. I mean, he very much enjoyed Oxford. He writes about enjoying his walks on the grounds of Magdalen College. And also, as I said, he was a very gregarious and convivial man. So there's some, I think John Kelly says that they, or possibly maybe Heaney in his Stepping Stones interviews, talks about going to music events at the Bullingdon Arms. And he also, I know he took road trips with Bernard and Heather O'Donoghue into the kind of Oxford countryside. So it was a very happy time. But again, he made an enormous impression there. His lectures were delivered in the examination schools. And of course they were packed lectures, not just students, but academics. And I think then great conviviality after them. And he enjoyed company. And yeah, he had a very happy time at Oxford. This was an Irish poet at the heart really of a very, I suppose, British literary establishment. Just 7 years before his appointment in 1982, he had been included in an anthology of British poets edited by Blake Morrison and Andrew Motion. And it caused a slight tension because Heaney, I mean, with good grace, but he objected to being listed as a British poet. Now, it was complicated by his friendship with Blake Morrison, who did a wonderful critical study of Heaney in 1982. It was more than just, it wasn't that he was being churlish. He'd already been included in an anthology of British poets in 1971. Now, at that stage, he doesn't make any objection, but then in 1982, things had changed for the worse, really, in Northern Ireland. It was the years of Thatcherism, the hunger strikes in Northern Ireland. A neighbour of Heaney's, Francie Hughes, had died in hunger strike. And so I think Heaney felt then that he wanted to distance himself in some ways from that aspect of Britishness, if you like. But he did it with great typical kind of grace, and with some kind of, I think he was pulled between his friendship with Blake Morrison, for example, and Andrew Motion, but still the need to speak and say something. So he published in 1983, he published an open letter in which he famously said, "Be assured my passport's green. No glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen." So it wasn't a churlish. He was defending, I suppose, his Irishness. I think that was important. So by 1989, when he becomes Oxford Professor of Poetry, I mean, that political mood has shifted, certainly in the 1990s. And even then, there's a letter from Ted Hughes to Heaney saying it'll be wonderful to see how Heaney acts as an Irish advocate, if you like, in England. An Irish poet, John Montague, said that the appointment was a potential Trojan horse, but Heaney was very careful to sidestep those political analyses of his appointment and focus really on fundamentally. Heaney was also a teacher, which I haven't mentioned before, but Heaney began as a secondary school teacher in Belfast, and then he also taught in a teacher training college in Dublin, in Carrisford. So he was by nature a teacher, and he saw his lectures in Oxford and elsewhere primarily as this was his role to teach, not, if you like, to be a propagandist for Irish nationalism or republicanism. I think that made him distinct in his appointment at Oxford. This Irish man, if you like, who had publicly defended his right to be Irish, yet here he is in the very heart of the kind of British literary establishment. So yeah, I mean, it's one of the most prestigious posts in poetry. It was inaugurated at the beginning of the 18th century, so 1708, and of course some very notable figures. Its contribution to university life, strictly speaking, I think, so the poet will give an inaugural lecture. So Heaney's was called The Redress of Poetry, which was the title then of his collected lectures from that time as professor. The poet's expected to give 3 lectures per year, so one lecture per term. And they're encouraged to participate in all their aspects of university life, helping students, guiding students with their work. Heaney in particular was very conscientious and gracious and generous, which is kind of characteristic of him as a person. He spent a lot of time with students. There's a great story that John Kelly tells. John Kelly was Professor of English at St John's College, and he was, like Seamus, an Irishman. And John Kelly tells a story of Seamus Heaney had agreed to meet students to read their essays, give them feedback on their work, and he was travelling back from Harvard. So he came back, he was jet lagged, he also had flu, and John Kelly insisted that Heaney rest up and cancel the meeting with students. But Heaney insisted on meeting with the students despite his jet lag and his flu. And at that meeting there was one young man whose essay was a kind of a criticism and a takedown really of Heaney's poetry. And John Kelly tells a story that Heaney was characteristically gracious, gave him feedback, and then they all had some drinks together. John Kelly and Seamus Heaney happened at one stage to be in the gents when this young man came in, and the young man then told Heaney he was applying for a job and asked if Heaney would write him a letter of reference, which Heaney did, which I think is a lovely story because it's a mark of his, I think, humility really and good grace and generosity. What's interesting is, I suppose, the background to the lectures in some way, or the background to Heaney's work before then, was that he grew up so he was born in 1939, as I said, in Northern Ireland. As you know, then the Troubles broke out, what became known euphemistically as the Troubles, in 1968, when he was really a very young poet. And the Troubles really formed the background to a lot of his work, especially his book North in 1975. And he felt, by the mid-1980s, he really felt the weight of a kind of a responsibility to address the conflict and the violence, while also trying to maintain the integrity of of his art. In 1989, just before he was elected Oxford Professor of Poetry, he published a poem called Fosterling. And it became quite famous because it was published eventually in a book called Seeing Things. And in that he talks about his poetry being, he says, sluggish in the doldrums of what happens. And then he says, me waiting until I was nearly 50 to credit marvels. So he's 50 in 1989. So there's this recognition that somehow the sorrow of the Northern Irish Troubles had coloured or maybe discoloured his work in some way, or that he felt somehow bound to say something about it. He thought that poetry had the capacity, if you like, to act as a counterbalance to the kind of, if you like, what Virgil called the lacrimae rerum, the tears of things. He quotes somewhere in the lectures Wallace Stevens, who talked about poetry as a violence from within that protects us from a violence from without. So, as I said, he was 50 when he took up the post. He's very conscious that he's in his kind of midlife and the direction that he wants his poetry to take. And again, then you have, I suppose, this coincidental redress at home in Northern Ireland as Ireland kind of, Northern Ireland creeps tentatively towards peace. So I think it shapes his work in the sense that it allows him, I suppose, the chance to reflect on the direction of his own work, using writing about speaking about other poets. And I suppose it helped Heaney hone his ideas of the importance of, as I said, the self-delight and inventiveness of language. What is it that language does? What does language do to us as human beings? How does it affect that redress or that balance? So I think, it was a point for him. I mean, he was nominated originally. Bernard O'Donoghue, who was a very good friend of Heaney's. Bernard was at Magdalen College then. There was a kind of a campaign mounted here by a kind of an Irish contingent to persuade Heaney to put his name forward for the post. I mean, the letters which have just been published recently by Faber show that there was a kind of a reluctance on Heaney's part initially, partly to do with even greater exposure. I mean, he was someone who was a poet who was known. I mean, he was a kind of a celebrity, which is very unusual for a poet. And so he felt, I think this was an additional weight, if you like. And yet he was aware of the magnitude of the post. So there's a letter he writes to Bernard O'Donoghue in February 1989, kind of saying that he's kind of given in to to Bernard's encouragement and people like John Kelly and others. And he accepts their nomination. Of course, then has to be voted on by both students and students who've been awarded their degrees, and then by academic staff. But he won by an overwhelming majority. One of the very early influences on Heaney when he boarded at St. Colum's in the mid-1950s was the poetry of the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. He was hugely influenced by Hopkins, and he writes some of his very early poems in kind of Hopkins' style. And then later in the 1980s, while he's at Harvard, he meets Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet. And Miłosz had a huge influence on Heaney then. And Miłosz really, again, is another poet who, confronts the kind of lacrimae rerum of his own times, but is also a great poet of praise. And I think that's sometimes possibly a neglected aspect of Heaney's work. And I think another aspect, I think, which hasn't maybe been given the kind of exposure by critics is Heaney is a poet of love. I mean, some of his most beautiful poems are about his wife Mary, his children, Catherine Ann and Michael and Christopher, his own parents. I mean, really deeply affecting poems. Of course, the earliest and maybe one of the most famous, certainly for anthologies and for school children, is Midterm Break, where he writes about the death of his brother Christopher, who was killed by a car when he was just almost 4. Seamus Heaney then was boarding at St. Colum's. It's a very straightforward, kind of simple poem, but I mean, still beautifully suggestive of just this awful tragedy, losing a young brother, and also I think being away from home, being driven back from St. Columns by a neighbour to the house where Christopher was being waked, the family home. And then he revisits that actually in District and Circle in 2006, 40 years on. Heaney's a deeply self-referential poet, so he'll come back. He'll come back, and so even District and Circle, while it's two lines of the underground, it's also the idea that he's circling round his home district again. He's back at what he called the omphalos, the kind of navel of his world and his imagination. And the early reviews focused on Heaney as a poet of nature, but he's much more than that. As I said, I think of poetry, a wonderful poet of childhood, a poet of praise, probably most importantly, a poet of love. In 2005, I was teaching then at St. Columns, and I wrote to Heaney asking if he would be prepared to come along and give a talk on the influence of the classics on his poetry. So he came along, he again very graciously agreed, and I collected him at Derry Airport at 9 o'clock. He got off the flight at 9 o'clock in the morning, and when he came off into the arrivals, it was January, and he was kind of wrapped up in a overcoat, scarf, kind of hat, probably because of the cold and probably part in disguise. But I mean, within moments, I could hear people who were there saying, "There's Seamus Heaney." One or two people approached him with pieces of paper and asked would he sign them, and he did. And I remember driving back, as we were driving to St. Columns, I kind of said to him, that must be at times quite tough, that you're recognised. And again, he was enormously gracious. He said, look, he said, Gary, if you put yourself out there as a poet and I suppose as a public figure, he said, well, that's what you expect, and therefore you can't complain. So he was gracious, but I suspect it took its toll at times. I know at book launches, queues of hundreds of people to get books signed, and he had enormous patience and enormous grace. And I think that's what he'd be remembered for also by people who knew him, not just the absolutely wonderful poems and prose essays, just his I think, humanity. That day I invited him to my parents' house for lunch. The lecture was at 4, so I invited him to my parents for lunch. And my father, at the time, he hadn't been diagnosed, but we were aware that there was something wrong, and he was later diagnosed with dementia. And so he didn't quite get who Seamus Heaney was. And I was kind of, nervous. I wanted the day to go well. And so I said to Seamus in the car, look, my father's not well, and we think it might be dementia. And when we sat down for lunch, he deliberately sat beside my father. I mean, he chose to sit there, and then spoke to my father really for most of the lunch, had him laughing and telling stories. And I was really struck, and I could see then something of the humanity that comes out in the poems. He was especially considerate towards my father. And when we got out to go into the car to drive to St. Columns, the first thing he said was, I thought your father did very well. So he was, he was a man really of, I think, great humanity. And that comes out in the poems. And that's, I suppose, what I mean by saying that I think as a legacy, I think he will be remembered as a poet of love.
The lecture finishes. Students spill out of the exam schools like baby squirrels pouring out of a tree stump and turn onto High Street in search of tea or coffee or a quiet place to edit. I feel a tap on my elbow. My heart stops in my throat. It's Jack's. His eyes shine down on me, and his wavy hair is tossed to the side. Eloise, he says, we need to talk. Let's go somewhere quiet. Jack smells of faint cigarette smoke and woodland cherries. I agree. We walk together in silence to the vaults and garden under St. Mary's. The cafe emits the soft scent of roasting vegetables, hot drinks and buttered toast. The cafe is hidden away inside a stone-vaulted room. We get pastries and drinks. As soon as we sit down, I feel a shift in Jax's mood. He looks me up and down unkindly. "So, Eloise," he says, his voice icy. "They tell me you have something that belongs to me." "Who's they?" I wonder, slightly panicked. He means the notebook, of course. And they must be whoever is leaving the funny notations. Or maybe he's heard gossip from someone poking around my room. A curious scout. College life is too cloistered. Nothing escapes. Should I admit it? I decide to come clean. "Yes, I'm so sorry, Jax. I found your notebook ages ago. It's just that we never see one another and are so busy. It's practically the first time we've spoken at length." He cuts me off. "You could have left it in my pidge." "Why would you keep it? Well, it's weird, Eloise." The term weird feels unduly harsh. I push my clotted cream and raisin scone to one side of the table. My stomach churns. "I'm sorry," I mumble. "And there's another thing I can't get over," he goes on. "The girls told me about attending the boat race uninvited. What on earth were you thinking? That was a private society event." I tell him I had noticed the insignia and was curious about it. His eyes flash with anger. "Listen," he says, "don't worry about that. If you don't have the notebook here, just put it in my pidge. I need to go. I can't talk about this with you right now. Or ever, really. It was wrong of you to take that." Jax stands up abruptly. Reluctantly, I leave most of my scone and follow him outside. I apologise again, but I sense a hostility now between us. Once outside the cafe, he turns on me. "Eloise," he sneers, "I'm only going to say this once. I heard about the MCR. That must have been another mistake. The invitation to the card game, the insignia, the MCR discussion. It was meant for me, not..." Jax cuts himself off. "Don't you have anything to say for yourself?" he growls. He stares at me with something poisonous and hateful in his eyes. In a way, I hate him too. I hate him for not being what I thought he would be. Beautiful and quintessential, a lover or a poet. Maybe even my first heartbreak. He's just another arrogant, self-centered social climber. A gossip and a charlatan. I realise that he wants this game, whatever it is, for himself. The trail of clues, from the library to the boat club to the MCR, is somehow intentional. Jax is being vetted for something bigger and more interesting than our petty college politics. And now, by fate or accident, I'm being vetted too. He hates me because he is competing with me. He cannot fathom how a nobody from a nothing town could be selected for, well, I'm not sure what, but if he's this angry, it must be something worth pursuing. I see envy and greed in his face, ugly emotions I never imagined he would possess. I had imagined Jax to be someone pure, remote and well-intentioned. Realism, then, wins this round. Without another word, I turn on my boot heel and march away, hot tears forming at the corners of my eyes. I go for a walk to clear my head. The city has lost its golden comfort to the cold blue light of unwaking spring. Night falls over spires by the time I am ready to return to college, tired but determined. The ink blue sky frames Gothic steeples and domes. There is a hushed reverence to the streets tonight.
Nightly, naturally, swimming towards the lure of warm lit-up places, the blurred mesh and murmur drifting among glasses in the gregarious smoke.
Gargoyles and grotesques jeer down at me as I storm down the alley behind the Turf Tavern under the Bridge of Sighs, back to college. In my outrage, I fail to notice I am being followed, until I am nearly at the door to my college. A hooded figure blocks my path. "Can I help you?" I ask distractedly. "Yes," jeers a muffled voice. Under the lamplight, I cannot make out the face of the stranger. Not Jax, too short. The voice is hoarse and unrecognisable. It scares me. "Stay away "From the cards," the voice whispers. A gloved hand reaches out and squeezes my arm, sharply. "You've been warned." The grasp is cold and uncompromising, like the talons of a fierce, predatory bird. I yank my arm back and fall against the door. I try to scream, but no sound comes out. The figure vanishes into a blanket of street shadow. Back in my dormitory, hallway lights buzz overhead as I scramble for my key. My hands are shaking. I barely manage to open the door. A wet sock is hanging from the ceiling over the smoke detector. The room is full of smoke. In the bin next to my desk, a small fire smoulders and sparkles. I can just make out the crisped corners of a pack of playing cards and the charred remains of the Queen of Hearts in the bin.
Episode 8 of Eloise and Oxonia was produced by Sid Walter and written by Dr. April Power. The episode features original readings by Judith Bunting and Professor John Gould. Mervyn Morris reads his own original poetry. Our interview on the work of Seamus Heaney features Dr. Gary Wade. Special thanks go to the National Poetry Archive for their support.